Ever have that friend that had a car that was so cool that you wished you had their car and they had a feather up their hind end and you'd both be tickled shitless? Well, stick around. We're going to talk about that today right here on the Prince Magnum channel. Hello again, and welcome to the Prince Magnum channel. I'm your host, Prince Magnum. Welcome once again to Do-It-Yourself Budget Hot Ride. Yes, we're bringing it back for another episode, and you know it's got to be special if we're bringing it back. Okay, recently you all know that I have made very good friends with a gentleman who runs his own YouTube channel all the way up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Yes, my friend, Cadillac Kid Productions. Mr. Cadillac Kid himself has a beautiful and gorgeous 1983 Pontiac Trans Am. He lovingly calls it Purple Penny. Penny is pretty much bone stock and is in pretty doggone good condition considering she's well over 30 years old. But the Cadillac Kid has recently released a video not too long ago discussing some of the things he doesn't like about his Trans Am. Well, I'm willing to bet with a little bit of time and effort, his Pontiac Trans Am can easily become a special budget hot rod. But before we dive too deep into this, we're going to have to travel back in time and take a look at the history of the Pontiac Trans Am. So let's travel back to the 1960s. Whoa, that's too far back. But we're going to go back to the 1960s. Let's briefly talk about how the pony car came into existence. In 1964 and a half, the Ford Mustang debuted and really hit the American market very well. Ford then tried to get the Mustang to get onto the SCCA circuits, the world circuits that we all know today that you typically see on the Gran Turismo games. But the problem was the Mustang had some issues. It had a lot of issues, mostly dealing with suspension. And Ford never really could get the Mustang on the SCCA circuits, and they tried hard. Well, General Motors decided to finally one-up Ford in a way that probably still sticks in the craw of every Ford lover everywhere. Well, that response was none other than the Camaro and the Pontiac Firebird, both released pretty much at the same exact time. Side note, the Pontiac Firebird and the Camaro share the same exact frame. That frame came from none other than, drum roll, the Chevy Nova. By 1970, they sat back down and started redesigning the cars again. The second generation came out about mid-1970. That's where you hear the 70.5 Camaro and things like that. Now, as you travel through the 70s, not only did horsepower numbers dip dramatically, we started seeing the chrome bumpers slowly fade away. But if you've got one of these cars, a lot of cars from the 70s, with the chrome bumpers, it just did not work out too well. Caver. These cars, I mean, they were ugly, they weren't super powerful, but if you knew what you were doing, you could get that power back in a real hurry. By 1977, the Pontiac Trans Am was made iconic by the movie Smokey and the Bandit. Side note, in the movie, Pontiac basically gave the production company for Smokey and the Bandit 3 Pontiac Trans Ams, identical. These cars were not as powerful as the movies would like to portray, and they didn't spend any time beefing these cars up to make those stunts. So by the end of the movie, they were actually piecing the 3 cars together to finish out the production. Most people don't know that. You're welcome to look that up. I believe that video information is actually on YouTube. Now, by 1982, GM sat back down and redesigned the Camaro and the Firebird, which the upscaled version of the Firebird is the Trans Am. We started seeing the wedge-shaped design that we're all familiar with the Pontiac Trans Am and the Camaros. We also now see the hatchback design that we're all familiar with in the 1980s. And amazingly enough, I am not a huge fan of that. To me, hatchback and sports car, they really just don't mix. It just doesn't fit together. Sorry to the guys who like the Honda Civic CRX. It's just, they don't belong together. You know, doesn't make any sense. Anyhow, moving on. Horsepower numbers started seeing a slight return in the 80s, but due to technology problems, fuel injection was still in its infancy. Side note, carburetors were starting to be phased out as far back as the late 70s, and we started seeing carburetors start receiving this kind of brain box that was wired into the carburetor. It was designed to help meter the fuel just like we would see in modern day fuel injection. But as I said, the technology was sort of there, but it wasn't as refined as we would think of it today, and had a tendency, usually by the end of the 80s, and in the worst, in the best case scenario, by the mid 90s, these carburetors were just falling apart, and in most cases, the technology, it just wasn't there. So that's why a lot of times you'll see them diesel, and because they're loading up with fuel, because the carburetor setup just wasn't working for them. By 1993, GM sat back down and redesigned the fourth generation Camaro and Pontiac Trans Ams. And then when Pontiac faded into history, when they shut down that branch of General Motors, Pontiac took with it the Trans Am and the Firebird. Not a half bad run for such an awesome car. Now, here in just a brief moment, I'm going to basically cut away using what pictures I have to basically explain the wonderful features of my friend Cadillac Kid and his amazing '83 Pontiac Trans Am. We're going to talk about some customizing ideas that I hope he takes and runs with. It's for you, buddy. And at the end of it all, we're going to come back. We're going to end it as usual, and I hope all of you have a great deal more knowledge you did than before you actually clicked on this video. I'll see you all in a moment.
Alright folks, let's get talking about my favorite 1983 Pontiac Trans Am, known as the Purple Penny. Let's start off with her suspension. Now, if you've watched any of the videos from the Cadillac Kid Productions and you've watched Penny being taken through corners and you just see her gripping, if you're like me, you're not surprised. Penny's amazing suspension has aged well because that's just the way a General Motors car is. If you know anything about GMs, they handled great in the 70s and they were even better in the 80s. I don't think General Motors has put a car down that'll even come close to what they had during this time frame. And since we're talking about the F-bodies from Pontiac and Chevy, the Camaro, the Trans Am, and the Firebird, it's safe to say that the aftermarket for making an already great handling car even better is vast, and it's cheap. That's really awesome for people like me. So Penny has tons of options available to her to make her very track worthy. So if my friend the Cadillac Kid wanted to take Penny to any track, it wouldn't be a problem with even the tightest budget imaginable. I hope he does. I'd like to see what he can really do with her. Alright, let's move on to her limited slip rear end. Now, I'm not going to bore you to tears with all the things that you need, that go into rear end technology. I'll just explain it as simple as this. The limited slip rear end is kind of that cross between a posi traction and a single track rear end. With limited slip, basically, when the power starts going to the pavement, one side is already gripping. The other side starts gripping a few moments later. Don't ask me how much time that takes. I'm not 100% sure on it. But because of this delayed response, for those people who are looking to make the car do donuts, fishtails, or even amazing power slides, this is no effort, and the Cadillac Kid has already shown that numerous times on his channel. Because of this, he's also able to get her back under control with, once again, no effort whatsoever. Limited slips are, like I said, just that crossroad between the two, and they do amazing underneath F-body cars. Also, I can tell you, because of Penny's amazing top speed, which is about 220 kilometers per hour, or for those of us who live in the US, that would be right around 140 miles per hour. That's really awesome. Well, I can tell you that the engines weren't that powerful at that time. So, it's safe to say that they gave her just enough torque and put some really high gears in her rear end. So, 140 miles per hour is not that hard to do. I'm almost betting they're about 273. Can you get better than that? Of course you can. Because General Motors, all their parts are easy to interchange, there's a great aftermarket, and you don't have to pay that much money, you could easily take the same GM rear end and slap in pretty much any ring and pinion gear you want, as far as what size you want to run. So you can easily take that rear end from 273 all the way up to a 411. I typically would lean towards something around 355 to 373. That's a good middle of the road. It won't hurt your gas mileage all that much, and it'd be great for the drag strip. It'll be great for any track, and it's still perfect for the road. Definitely an option I would definitely select. Alright, let's talk about her 3-speed automatic. The Cadillac Kid says that he doesn't like it. It's not a proper gearbox. Well, it may not be manual, but it's definitely something you shouldn't turn your nose up at. But before we dive too far into this, if he's running a 200 metrics, I would throw that thing as far away from me as possible. 200 metrics from General Motors were just absolute jokes. Now, the real 3-speed automatics are the 350 turbo and the 400 turbo. 350 turbos were usually bolted to small block V8s, whereas 400 turbos were bolted to the really powerful small blocks, and yes, the infamous big block V8s. Both transmissions also made their way into 4-wheel drive trucks, if that's any indication how good these are. That being said, the 350 turbo and the 400 turbo are the most customizable automatics on the market to date. And they're amazing at really putting power to the pavement if you don't want a manual. A B&M shift improvement kit and a little bit of working on the internals, a 350 turbo can handle. I've actually had one that was designed to handle all the way up to 450 horses, even though the engine didn't put that kind of power out. That's why it lasted me forever, and I took good care of it. A 400 turbo automatically is designed to handle lots of power anyways. However, you can make it handle even better. The 400 turbo was actually bolted up to the 454 LS6 that you would have found in the 70 Chevelle Super Sport. And that's the ones that didn't have the M22 Muncie. So that should be a definite indicator that 3-speed automatics are very tough, they're very reliable, and if you know how to finesse them a little bit, they're great for getting power to the pavement. Also, if you still would rather have a manual but you don't want to fiddle around with a clutch, no problem. GM transmissions, as I said, are easily customizable. You can take your regular valve body off that runs off of a vacuum, plug all that stuff up, and you put on a manual valve body. Now she shifts just like a manual, but it's still an automatic. It's a manual, it's an automatic. No, it's both. So, again and again and again, General Motors nailed cheap hot rodding long before I was born. All right, let's move on to Penny's very, very sad 305. I'm not going to bore you all to death with details. I'm just going to say that every car company has had that one engine or a couple of them that nobody wants to talk about. Well, the 305 is one of them. And GM really tried to push the 305 as a great engine, but it had a lot of problems. The crankshafts were weak. You were running a 2-bolt main. They were trying to push it as kind of a cheap hot rodding engine, but they just couldn't handle normal wear and tear. I've actually had one that only had 150,000 miles on it, and watched the crankshaft go right through the side of the engine block. I've had them where they just had no power whatsoever. They're absolutely one of the worst V8s that General Motors ever made. That being said, that doesn't mean you can't make them good. The first thing that the Cadillac Kid talked about is the fact that she likes to diesel when he goes to shut her off. Well, I could tell you just by listening to that alone, the reason being is that at this time, GM was kind of experimenting with switching over to electronic fuel injection. So they, in an attempt to start, doing this, guess what? They were putting brain boxes on carburetors. Now, when these brain boxes start acting up, or the carburetor itself starts acting up, you might as well just scrap that whole setup and start over. Thankfully, there's a great aftermarket available, and all of it will fit right underneath Penny's hood. A simple, simply going to a stock version intake manifold, and a good Holley 4-barrel, or even if he wanted to keep it, really GM, he could easily get an aftermarket reproduction Rochester Quadrajet. If you go to do a Rochester Quadrajet, make sure you get it from Holley, and make sure you get it with the smaller jets up front. That'll improve your gas mileage and still give you the power and performance that we all love from a good 4-barrel. The next thing that anybody should also understand, be careful. The 305, the 267, and 262, the bolt pattern for the exhaust manifolds were just slightly different. The heads were even slightly different. Where the manifolds bolted onto the head, it just wasn't quite the same. The manifolds are actually smaller in length. You'll go to bolt on one that you might have for a 350, and you'll notice that the bolt holes at the back don't quite match up. Well, that's because slightly smaller. They didn't really fix that till they started coming out with center bolt heads in about 1985, I believe. But don't let that deter you. All you got to do when you go in and order a set of headers, or go to do anything like that, just make sure that they know it's a 305 or 5.0, depending on where you live in the world, for a 1983. Just make sure that they know it's, that one little time frame where General Motors was evidently doing some heavy drugs. Okay? Also, because we are talking about a GM, let me say again that the small block V8 is by far one of the most easily customizable V8 in the world. Because of this, the Cadillac Kid can easily take his anemic 305, just swap around a few parts, and he'll be out running most new sports cars, including those rice burner Jap cars that you might see today and that tuners just love to whack off to. However, if he really wants to make a ground stomper, I'll tell you all a little secret. If he starts off with a Chevrolet 350 and puts a crankshaft similar to a 283 in it, make sure it's forged, and the same type of connecting rods for the 283, he's made the Chevrolet 302, the same one they were putting in the Z28 from 1967 to 1969 that was advertised at 299 horses. Notice I said advertised. I didn't say actual horsepower. Estimates on that go up to about 450 horses with about 11 to 1 compression ratio, an L79 327 cam. He will have a monstrous engine that will probably break the sound barrier, if you catch my drift. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this little bit of insight into what I know about the car world when it comes to General Motors, and why I absolutely love the Cadillac Kid's 1983 Pontiac Trans Am that he lovingly calls Purple Penny. Thank you all so much. I'll see you on the other side of this.
Well, welcome back. What an awesome video. I feel this is going really well so far. Let me give you all another quick side note. The Cadillac Kid right now is in possession of a very iconic car from the 80s. The Trans Am and the Firebird, I mean, basically were the same car. And most people will always remember that car from the hit TV show Knight Rider, one of my all-time favorites. Thinking of you, Hoff. Anyhow, Pontiac, after the first few episodes, people were actually showing up to dealerships asking for kit. And Pontiac was like, we don't have anything like the TV show, and actually forbid them to actually say that it was a Trans Am. So that's a little bit of TV history for you right there. And that brings us to the end of this. I hope my friend Cadillac Kid really enjoys this video. This was really for him because he's not getting the support from everybody like he really should. I mean, he's an awesome hot rodder. You know, he's doing things that I'm working up to, you know. He's doing some really awesome stuff. So if you are a subscriber to the Prince Magnum channel, please do me a favor. As soon as this video is over, go over to the Cadillac Kid Productions. Like and subscribe his stuff. I'm telling you, there's no other guy like this out there in the hot rodding world, and he deserves more support than he's actually getting right now as we're speaking. Alright, as always, this is the Prince Magnum channel. Like and subscribe if you would. Get out there and work on a project. If you got a sweetheart, sweep them off their feet. And above all, if nobody has told you that they love you today, Prince Magnum does. God bless you, and have a happy 24. Thank you.
Good night, ladies.